German troops were notorious for their treatment of captured Soviet women. Rape, torture, and execution were common. Women who fell into enemy hands rarely survived. Even worse, those who did return were often treated with suspicion by their own side. The Soviet system did not see them as victims. It saw them as possible traitors. As Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, the world witnessed one of the deadliest chapters in human history. Entire cities were flattened, villages were burned, millions were slaughtered. And yet, out of this chaos rose a force the Nazis never expected: Soviet women, armed and determined to defend their homeland. But behind the medals, behind the propaganda posters showing smiling women in uniform, there was another reality. A reality soaked in blood, fear, and unbearable trauma. Because these women were not only fighting the enemy, they were also fighting to survive in an army and in a war that often saw them as expendable. In the early stages of the German invasion, Soviet losses were massive. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed within days. As desperation grew, the Soviet government opened the door for women to join the Red Army, not just as nurses or radio operators, but as snipers, pilots, machine gunners, tank drivers, and scouts. It was the only major power in the Second World War to deploy women in direct combat in such large numbers. By the end of the war, over 800,000 women had served in the Soviet military. That number sounds heroic, but the truth is far more complex. For many of these women, joining the military was not just patriotism, it was survival. Nazi forces had already begun slaughtering civilians across the Western Soviet Union. In cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, families were massacred. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Some women had already seen their homes destroyed and their loved ones executed. Picking up a rifle felt like the only choice left. Others were teenagers, eager to help, inspired by a sense of duty. They lied about their age, forged documents, and begged recruitment officers to let them fight. The Soviet propaganda machine celebrated this devotion. Posters showed women marching with pride, their rifles raised high, their faces fearless. But the moment those women arrived at the front lines, the smiles faded. The training camps were brutal. Food was scarce. Conditions were filthy. Women often had to share uniforms, sometimes changing clothes in front of male soldiers. Many were mocked, belittled, or sexually harassed during drills. Some officers refused to train women at all, saying it was a waste of time. Despite the obstacles, many women quickly proved themselves in battle. Soviet sniper Lyudmila Pavlichenko became a legend with over 300 confirmed kills. The Night Witches, an all-female bomber squadron, terrorized German forces with nighttime raids using wooden planes and deadly accuracy. These stories are often celebrated, but they are not the full story. Behind the battlefield victories were sleepless nights spent in freezing trenches, soaked clothes, lice, rotting boots, bodies torn apart by artillery, and the constant fear of dying without anyone even remembering your name. For every medal awarded, there were countless untold stories of suffering. Many women were sent to the front lines with little more than basic training. Some were used as bait in ambush missions, told to draw fire so their male comrades could locate the enemy. Others were forced to carry wounded men through fields laced with landmines, knowing one wrong step would end everything. Women who served as medics had to crawl across battlefields filled with corpses, dragging injured soldiers back under fire. Often, they were unarmed. If the enemy advanced too quickly, they were the first to be captured. And that is where another layer of horror began. But not all the threats came from the enemy. Inside their own units, some women faced abuse from Soviet officers and soldiers. Assaults were rarely reported, and if they were, nothing was done. In many cases, women were threatened into silence. If they resisted, they risked being sent to punishment battalions, frontline units where death was almost guaranteed. Some were forced into relationships with commanding officers. These were not romantic connections. They were often based on survival. Women who refused risked losing food, shelter, or protection. Even when they were not directly abused, women had to live with constant pressure. They were expected to prove themselves twice as much as the men. One mistake could lead to humiliation, punishment, or worse. And if they succeeded, jealousy or resentment often followed. It was a battlefield within a battlefield. These women were not only fighting fascism, they were fighting to be seen as human beings in a system that valued them more as symbols than as individuals. The front lines of the Eastern Front were not just violent, they were hell on earth. The war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was the most brutal theater of the Second World War. And for Soviet women thrown into this furnace, survival became a slow, painful journey through both physical agony and mental collapse. It was not simply the bullets or bombs that wore them down. It was the cold. It was the hunger. It was the silence of no one coming to help. During long stretches of combat, soldiers, men and women alike, often went days without warm food. Rations ran low. Rotten bread, frozen soup, and boiled horse meat became common meals. Water, if not frozen, was often drawn from trenches filled with blood and filth. Female soldiers, unlike their male counterparts, had another problem. Their bodies bled every month, but sanitary supplies were never provided. Most resorted to scraps of cloth, which were reused again and again until they disintegrated. There were no safe places to change, no privacy, no hygiene. Many developed infections. Others were mocked when they asked for help. Sleep became a luxury. In the freezing winters of 1942 and 1943, Soviet soldiers slept in holes dug into snowbanks, often wrapping themselves in dead comrades' coats. Frostbite was constant. Fingers and toes blackened. Some women lost entire limbs before being pulled from the battlefield. The stench of decomposing flesh lingered for weeks. Sometimes, corpses were used to patch holes in bunkers. Others were buried in shallow graves that caved in during heavy rains. Rats became common. They chewed through bags, boots, and even corpses. Some women began talking to themselves. Others refused to eat or sleep. Nightmares became normal. Fear turned into numbness. The human mind can only endure so much before breaking. But the Soviet state had no tolerance for weakness. If a woman showed signs of psychological distress, she was often accused of cowardice. Some were reassigned to punishment squads. Others were removed and forgotten. Compassion was seen as disloyalty. Crying was shameful. And trauma was weakness. There were times when the battlefield itself became a form of torture. Some female scouts were ordered to walk into enemy territory alone at night, without weapons. Their goal? Gather intelligence, memorize troop movements, and return before sunrise. But the snow made every footstep loud. The cold made every breath visible. Most never made it back. Snipers, though deadly and highly trained, were expected to remain in fixed positions for days. They urinated in place, ate what little they could carry, slept sitting up with rifles across their laps. If they moved, they could be spotted. If they were spotted, they were killed. One woman described lying still for over 48 hours in -30-degree weather, unable to scratch an itch or blink too often, watching as enemy soldiers searched the forest for her body heat. When sniper teams were captured by German troops, they were rarely taken alive. Female snipers were especially hated. Nazi propaganda described them as witches, unnatural creatures who had betrayed their womanhood. Captured snipers were tortured slowly, their fingers broken one by one, their eyes gouged out before execution. Female pilots, such as those in the famed all-female night bomber regiment, flew outdated, loud biplanes that made them easy targets. They had to cut their engines mid-air and glide silently toward the target to avoid detection. Once bombs were dropped, they had seconds to restart the engines and escape into the night. They flew without parachutes. Many died in burning wrecks. Others were shot down over enemy territory and captured. Very few were ever rescued. When the guns finally fell silent in the spring of 1945, millions across Europe celebrated the end of the Second World War. In the Soviet Union, streets filled with parades, music, and waves of red flags. Victory had come at a staggering cost, over 20 million Soviet lives lost. And among the survivors were thousands of women who had served with bravery, strength, and resilience on the front lines. But the moment peace arrived, their struggle did not end. In many ways, it only changed form. Soviet female veterans returned home not as heroes, but as problems. There were no national programs to support them, no mental health services, no pensions or compensation for most. Instead, they were met with suspicion, judgment, and silence. Society had moved on. The war was over, and now women were expected to step back into traditional roles as wives, mothers, and caretakers. No one wanted to hear about what they had done or what they had seen. The war had made them different, and that difference made people uncomfortable. Women who had worn uniforms and carried weapons were now treated as damaged or immoral. Rumors spread quickly. If a woman had been at the front, some assumed she must have used her body to survive. Whispers followed them into workplaces, into classrooms, even into their own homes. Some were labeled as traitors or prostitutes without evidence. Others were refused marriage by men who said they did not want women who had been with too many men. It did not matter whether they had served as medics, snipers, or engineers. Their stories were erased before they could be told. The Soviet regime, desperate to rebuild its image of the ideal family, played a role in this erasure. Wartime propaganda had once celebrated female soldiers. But after victory, that narrative shifted. Now the ideal Soviet woman was again portrayed as a quiet, selfless mother, not a hardened combat veteran. The official history books barely mentioned the role women had played in battle. Medals were given, but records were buried. Even basic support was missing. Women who had lost limbs in battle were not offered the same rehabilitation as their male counterparts. Those suffering from post-traumatic stress were often ignored or institutionalized. And for women who had been assaulted during the war, whether by enemy soldiers or their own, there was nowhere to turn. One former pilot, who had flown nearly 100 bombing missions, described returning to her village and being shunned. Her neighbors told her she had seen too much. They warned their daughters to stay away from her. She never married. She never spoke publicly about what she had experienced. For women who had lost their homes and families, reintegration became even harder. With no property, no income, and no government assistance, many found themselves homeless. Others tried to live with distant relatives, only to be treated as burdens or outsiders. Some attempted to return to their pre-war professions: teachers, nurses, engineers. But in the late 1940s, job shortages pushed women to the back of the line. Male soldiers were given priority. Women were expected to clean, cook, and stay silent. For those who had become pregnant during the war, things were even worse. Many had no idea where the fathers of their children were. Some were dead, others had disappeared, and a few had simply refused to take responsibility. Single mothers in post-war Soviet society were often ridiculed, labeled as failures or morally corrupt. Their children, too, faced bullying and discrimination. Teachers scolded them. Classmates mocked them. And all the while, no one spoke about how those children had come to be. The silence was not only social, it was institutional. The government, eager to control the narrative of victory, discouraged open discussion about the darker parts of the war. Veterans who spoke out about rape, betrayal, or the horrors they witnessed, were warned to stay quiet. Some were even arrested for spreading anti-Soviet propaganda. Decades passed before any meaningful recognition came. In the 1960s and 70s, a few authors and historians began collecting testimonies from female veterans. Their books circulated quietly, often without official approval. One of the most important voices was that of Svetlana Alexievich, a Belarusian journalist who began documenting the emotional stories of Soviet women who had lived through the war. Through their words, a new truth emerged, one that had been buried for years. These women had not only endured bullets and bombs, they had endured betrayal by the very system they fought to protect. Some veterans wrote secret diaries. Others kept small boxes of medals hidden in closets, never showing them to friends or neighbors. Their war was not one of glory, it was one of survival. And after all the bravery, the reward was loneliness. Despite this, many never stopped caring about the cause they had once believed in. Some still marched in parades on Victory Day, wearing old uniforms that no longer fit. Others placed flowers on graves of fallen comrades, speaking their names softly so they would not be forgotten. There was pain, yes, but there was also pride. Because these women knew the truth, even if no one else wanted to hear it. They had faced fire and frost, violence and violation. They had fought for their country, and when the war was over, they had continued fighting for their dignity. Not all survived that second battle. As the Soviet Union marched toward the Cold War, new enemies replaced old ones, and national memory reshaped itself like wet cement. The Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War as it was known in the USSR, became a symbol of unity, courage, and glory. But buried deep beneath that image was an untold history, a hidden layer of truth etched into the bodies and minds of women who had served, bled, and suffered in silence. Official state museums filled their halls with statues of male generals and rows of tanks. Schoolchildren learned about major battles, heroic speeches, and the triumph of socialism over fascism. But rarely did they hear about female gunners, pilots, or medics. They never heard about the women who froze in trenches, the women who died during childbirth in field hospitals, the women who lost everything and asked for nothing. Many wartime records related to female units, incidents of sexual violence, and reports from punishment battalions were sealed by the state. Some were edited, others were destroyed. Scholars attempting to access military archives in later decades were often denied or met with redacted documents. What remained was heavily curated, a version of history where women were either invisible or romanticized into harmless icons of sacrifice. The silencing of these women was not only political, it was cultural. Families discouraged discussion about the war. Daughters were told not to ask. Grandmothers stayed quiet. A generation of Soviet women grew old knowing that their sacrifices were being erased in real time. Some tried to speak out. A few veterans, well into their 70s and 80s, began sharing their experiences in small local interviews or independent oral history projects. Their stories were often disturbing, full of pain, despair, and truth too uncomfortable for public broadcasting. One woman recalled hiding under a broken tank with a wounded comrade for 2 days, fending off wild dogs at night and watching him bleed to death. Another spoke of being left behind during a retreat, captured by Nazi forces, and passed from one soldier to another until she managed to escape. A former medical officer described a commander who forced her into silence after she tried to report the abuse of younger nurses. Their voices trembled, but their memories were sharp. Decades had passed, but the nightmares had not faded. What hurt the most, many of them said, was not what the enemy had done. It was how their own people had forgotten them.